John Doe. It's a name you've likely heard before, a name often used as an example or as a placeholder, and it's also a name that's given to unidentified murder victims. These victims who have lost not only their lives, but also their names and their identities. Some are given nicknames, such as a man who's become known as One-Eyed Jack, a man who was found murdered in Alaska in 1979 and has still never been identified. Hey everyone, my name is Lauren Elizabeth and welcome to my channel. Here I talk about true crime, unsolved mysteries, and missing people. If you like that type of thing, consider sticking around and maybe subscribing to the channel. Today we're talking about a John Doe case, a victim known as One-Eyed Jack. And he actually didn't get that nickname until a little while into the investigation, but I'll start off calling him Jack from the beginning to avoid confusion. It was the late summer of 1979 in Tok, Alaska, when Jack was found. Tok is a small area home today to only just over 1,000 people. That morning in 1979, a man had been out collecting firewood in a remote area just off the Alaska Highway, when he spotted something out of place: human skeletal remains. Police arrived on the scene and recovered the body, which had been torn apart by animals, leaving bones and remains strewn around the area. They also recovered a black eye patch among the remains. They determined that the victim had been dead for around a year and that his remains showed evidence that he had been stabbed to death. He had been a man somewhere between 25 and 35 years old, standing 6 feet tall. He had long brown curly hair and also a beard. He was found to have been missing his left eye, confirming to investigators that the black eye patch found had likely been his. Among the remains, they also found an orange and white marble, which investigators believe he may have sometimes used as a false eye. He had been wearing a green and brown plaid jacket, blue jeans, a green and white plaid shirt, brown hiking boots, and a yellow bandana. In his pockets, they found a dime and a nickel, both of which were Canadian coins. They also found 3 packs of matches and 2 packs of Winston cigarettes, leading investigators to believe that their victim had been a heavy smoker. However, one thing they did not find at the scene was the victim's mandible, or lower part of his jaw. Investigators believe it had been carried off by animals, and it's never been found. There was no identification found, and there were no missing person reports in the area that seemed to be a match, leading investigators to be unable to identify their victim. They put out forensic sketches to the public, but still, nobody seemed to know who he was. Eventually, this man would come to be known as One-Eyed Jack. However, his true identity is still a mystery. With the murder having been committed over a year earlier and police not even knowing the identity of the victim, they certainly didn't have any leads on who the killer could be, until a man came forward to identify himself as having been One-Eyed Jack's killer. And it's at this part I would just like to mention that I couldn't find as much solid information about this case as I would have liked to, especially for this next part of the story. There is a story in a series of events. However, whenever I try to track down the original source of this information, I can't seem to find it. I've seen this story repeated on several blogs and websites and places that I believe to be reputable, and I believe the source of this information existed at one point, but it seems to just be not there anymore. It seems to be dead links or sites that don't have it posted anymore whenever I try to find it. Normally I would expect to find either police reports or contemporary news articles from the time, or maybe something that has a direct quote from an investigator. I did find one blog with this information that mentioned an investigator by name, and this man is in fact an Alaska State Trooper. And I also found the same set of information posted by the forensic artist that actually drew Jack's composite image. So I do believe the information I'm about to tell you is accurate, but I just didn't feel quite as confident in my research as I normally do, so I wanted to put that little note in here. But anyway, back to the story. Investigators had no leads on who One-Eyed Jack was or who his killer was, until a man in Oregon confessed to having committed the murder. The killer's name was Burt Bishop. Not too long after Jack's body had been found, Bishop was being questioned by police in Oregon about a series of crimes that he was suspected of having committed all across the U.S. He then confessed that he had murdered a hitchhiker near the Alaskan-Canadian border in October of 1978. Burt Bishop had been on the run. He'd somewhat recently broken out of a halfway house in Los Angeles and fled to his girlfriend's house in Boise, Idaho. However, after believing that his girlfriend's house was under police surveillance, he decided to flee to Alaska. He said he picked up the hitchhiker not too far into his trip, just north of Boise, Idaho. He said the hitchhiker decided to go with him to Alaska. I believe the hitchhiker was a bit of a drifter himself, or maybe just didn't have an exact plan of action or a plan of where he was going, because it seems he just wanted to tag along with whoever picked him up. Jesse Burt Bishop described the hitchhiker as a tall man, a smoker with dark curly hair, a beard, and an eye patch, matching the description of One-Eyed Jack. He also described the hitchhiker's clothing as matching what had been found with the body. Bishop said that he thought he'd remembered the man telling him that he was 32 years old, and that he had lost his eye in a logging accident in Oregon. He also thought that he may have been working at a Lincoln car dealership in either Utah or Colorado. Bishop said that the man also told him he had been married. However, Bishop added that he thought the man seemed like a liar and he couldn't trust anything he said. According to Bishop, he said that the hitchhiker's name had been something with a J, he thought maybe Jack or John. And it was due to this claim and his eye patch that the victim eventually became known as One-Eyed Jack. Apparently, Bishop began getting more and more annoyed with Jack the longer they were on the road. According to Bishop, Jack complained too often, talked too much, and was a liar. Bishop decided at some point while the pair were driving through Canada that he was going to kill Jack. When later asked why he'd killed him, he simply said because he was really getting on his nerves. Bishop was so annoyed with Jack, he was going to kill him. Instead of just, simply telling him to get out of the car, he decided he was going to kill him and started planning how he was going to do it. Apparently, he didn't want to commit the murder in Canada, and so he waited until they crossed the border into Alaska. And not too far past the border, he surprised Jack and stabbed him to death before dumping his body just off the Alaska highway. And Bishop was able to describe the approximate location where Jack's body had been found. I couldn't find out what exactly happened to Jesse Burt Bishop. I believe, or assume, he would have faced some sort of sentence after admitting to a murder, as well as his other crimes that he was apparently accused of. However, I couldn't find any sort of details on any sort of trial or sentence. I did read, though, that Jesse Burt Bishop apparently died while in prison in California in either 2002 or 2003. As I mentioned earlier, I couldn't find as much information as I would have liked to about Jesse Burt Bishop. When I search him online, all I get are results of people talking about the One-Eyed Jack case. I can't find any record of his previous crimes, I can't find a mention of him in any news articles, and I can't find his mugshot, or any photo of him actually. And a lot of the results when I search for him actually lead to another killer, a man named Jesse Walter Bishop. And I've actually even seen some confusion in this case where some people think Jesse Walter Bishop was connected to the One-Eyed Jack case. But they are two completely different people. Jesse Burt Bishop confessed to having killed One-Eyed Jack, while Jesse Walter Bishop is a totally separate guy who also just happens to be a convicted killer. So if your last name is Bishop, maybe don't name your son Jesse. Maybe. But while we know who killed One-Eyed Jack, we still don't know who Jack was himself. Both police and amateur web sleuths have poured through missing persons cases looking for a potential match, but there hasn't been much that's been found. One man people had looked at in this case was a man named John Haywood Baratow. John was an Army vet and was apparently known to frequently move all around the United States and frequently change his appearance. He was last heard from in January of 1977. As far as I can tell, he was not known to have the signature missing eye. John Baratow has been ruled out by police, and we know he's not the same guy. John Baratow is the only official exclusion or rule out in this case. Another man I've seen mentioned as a possibility is a man named Billy Joe Marshall. Billy went missing from Indiana in April of 1974, when he was 37 years old. Billy is missing an eye, although he was missing his right eye, while One-Eyed Jack was missing his left. Billy Marshall hasn't been officially ruled out, however, I personally do not think that he is One-Eyed Jack. Mainly because he was missing his right eye while Jack was missing his left, and also Billy Marshall would have been a bit older than what Jack was thought to be. Next up is a man named Dwayne Alexander Decio, who went missing from Montana in 1974 at the age of 25. Dwayne was around the right height and right age to be One-Eyed Jack, and roughly matched the physical description. Although Dwayne Decio was not known to be missing an eye. But Dwayne went missing 4 years before One-Eyed Jack was killed. So if Dwayne was Jack, he could have lost an eye at some point after he went missing. Dwayne was also married, just as Jack had apparently claimed to be. Dwayne had actually only been married for a year before he disappeared. He had called his mother a few days before disappearing and said he'd talk to her again soon, but he's never been heard from since. A serial killer named Thomas Creech has claimed that he killed Dwayne Decio. However, he has also claimed to have taken the lives of over 40 people, and it's believed that a lot of his confessions are actually false confessions. Investigators are unsure whether or not Thomas Creech was actually involved with Dwayne's disappearance or his death, and they don't even know if Dwayne Decio is actually dead. He could still be out there. I do think Dwayne Decio is a candidate for possibly being One-Eyed Jack. However, there's definitely a lot of info that just doesn't fit. Firstly, I think One-Eyed Jack seemed to be a bit of a drifter, or the type of person that would randomly go to Alaska with the person that picked them up while they were hitchhiking. Whereas Dwayne Decio had recently gotten married, and he didn't have any plans or reason to suddenly leave. He had just told his mom on the phone he'd talk to her in a few days, before never being heard from again. Also, of course, Dwayne did have both of his eyes at the time of disappearing. However, that was 4 years before One-Eyed Jack was murdered, so he could have potentially lost an eye in that time. Then there's Franklin David Harder. He was 25 years old when he went missing in April of 1978. He does bear a physical resemblance to One-Eyed Jack, and is even seen wearing a plaid shirt, just as we know One-Eyed Jack had been wearing. Franklin went missing from Grangerville, Idaho, which is about 4 hours north of Boise, which lines up with where Jesse Bishop claims he picked up One-Eyed Jack. Franklin Harder was described as a quiet and eccentric guy, and some think perhaps the type of guy that would maybe spontaneously leave and hitchhike his way to Alaska. The location, age, and physical description of Franklin Harder line up with the possibility of him being One-Eyed Jack. However, one glaring error is that Franklin Harder was not missing an eye, as far as we know. And considering Franklin went missing only a few months before One-Eyed Jack was killed, it seems less likely that he could have lost an eye in this time period like I had suggested for Dwayne Decio. However, it is still a possibility. One more consideration is Andrew Michael Maloney. Andrew was 28 years old when he disappeared in September of 1977. He disappeared from Ketchum, Idaho, which is around 3 hours east of Boise, near where Jesse had picked up One-Eyed Jack. I couldn't find too much information about the circumstances of Andrew's disappearance, other than that his car was found abandoned near Ketchum, Idaho, and no trace of him has ever been found. He was 28 years old when he went missing. He stood around 6 feet tall and had long brown hair. And as with the other men in question, Andrew was not known to have been missing an eye. However, as mentioned before, he could have potentially sustained an injury and lost an eye at some point between disappearing and when he was killed, if he was in fact One-Eyed Jack. And while One-Eyed Jack might very well be one of these men, there's also a very good possibility that he isn't any of these men, and he's instead someone who was never reported missing in the first place, or someone whose case has fallen through the cracks. The man who's come to be known as One-Eyed Jack has been without his true identity for over 40 years now. Jack would have been in his 20s or 30s in 1978. He was tall, with long, dark, curly hair and a beard. He was missing his left eye, possibly lost in a logging accident, and he wore an eye patch. Remember, his mandible or lower jawbone was never found, so the jawline shown in some of the composite images is simply a guess on the part of the forensic artist. He was likely a heavy smoker. He was possibly from Idaho, Oregon, Colorado, or Utah. He may have at some point worked at a Lincoln dealership, and he may have at some point been employed as a logger. He was thought to have possibly been married. His name was believed to have started with J, possibly Jack, or possibly John. Although all the details we know about One-Eyed Jack could be taken with a bit of a grain of salt. Jesse Burt Bishop, the killer, said that he believed Jack had lied to him, and also, we don't know if Bishop was lying to investigators or even simply misremembering the hitchhiker. But nonetheless, this is still all the information we have to go off of. If you think you have any information that could help to identify One-Eyed Jack and give him his real name back, you can contact the Alaska State Troopers office at 907-883-5111. And that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching this video, and if you'd like to see more from me, subscribe to the channel. I will see you next time. Stay safe, everybody.